During an election, it is common to hear from an abundance of experts, reporters, and poll trackers, but we want to make sure voices of everyday people don't get lost in that mix. So, CBC Saskatchewan has brought together a panel of community leaders from across the province. It's called the Contributors Panel, and they join me now. Jairus Swidrovich is a First Nations pharmacist in Saskatoon. Adrian Ivey is a rancher and agriculture advocate in Ituna. And Juliette Bouchy is an educator and PhD student in Regina. Thanks to all of you for being here. Jairus, we're going to start with you. What are some of the issues you're paying attention to during this election?
Well, I'm paying attention to a lot right now, and it's really been interesting to witness platforms that differ seemingly between money and people. I'm looking for platforms that focus on the lives of people and not just money. And so this means a suicide strategy. This means all aspects of health and wellness. And I think about all the social determinants of health in there too, like housing, early childhood development, food security. I think about the costs of food between all necks and corners of our province. I'm thinking about transportation, how we get across the province within the province and also outside of the province. I think about income. I'm quite concerned about the opioid and overdose crisis, and I'm concerned about the lack of funding to Prairie Harm Reduction's safe consumption site. I'm also thinking about climate action, education, racism, anti-racism, and also how the parties or the government of Saskatchewan create a province that works for all of us, and upstream thinking, not just yearly annual budgets or a 4-year term budget, but thinking upstream.
Very engaged. Thanks for that. Adrian, what issues are you and other people in rural communities focusing on?
I think that there are so many issues that definitely impact all of Saskatchewan, but are really, really specific to people living in the rural spots of our province. I'm looking at things like rural healthcare and education, and the things like connectivity, especially in these times of COVID, how we're making sure that our most isolated people are still being kept connected through both cellular and Wi-Fi broadband. I'm paying very close attention to not only what the promises are in these areas, but also how they're costed out. I think it's really important that there's a plan for how we're going to pay for these things. And then a big thing for me is trade, which so many people see as a federal jurisdiction, but Saskatchewan is an export province, and things like agriculture, mining, forestry all depend on trade. So what are we doing as a province to focus on that and to really promote Saskatchewan to the global economy?
Juliette, what about you? What issues are top of mind for you and people in your community?
Thank you for the question. So again, systemic racism has been a very important and a big issue actually for my community, especially with licensing. For example, we have many graduates and medical doctors with outstanding resume and many years of experience, and still can't get a job or still can't get some practice in Saskatchewan. They end up working in care homes, and I'm not talking about a year or two, but we're looking at 4 or 5 years working in a care home while being a medical doctor, but they work in the care home as care aides. We're looking at systemic racism as well in all ramifications, in all systems, in education, in healthcare, social services. We are also concerned about with the pandemic as well. We see that the rates are going higher. We are not certain as to what will happen. But our businesses as well, Black businesses in Saskatchewan, most in the middle of the pandemic, we see that some businesses actually closed down. We are also being affected as well by that. We are worried about our small businesses. There are lots of issues and concerns as well about Black organizations as well, and community cultural organizations that are supposed to provide services for Black people, but now, because of the pandemic, they have no money, right? They are grossly underfunded. These are some of the issues as well. Childcare, our elders as well, they need their pension, and just a lot of issues as well around health and wellness. And racism really has been a very determining factor, really, that has really limited our opportunity and also for us to, again, achieve whole health and personal development. So those are the things that we are really concerned about.
Jairus, what do parties need to do during this election period to get Indigenous communities more engaged and as engaged as possible?
Well, I think there's a really complex and complicated history with the Indigenous peoples in Canada and in Saskatchewan and our colonial governments, just like the provincial government of Saskatchewan. And what we just heard regarding racism and systemic racism, I've also heard a sitting MLA in Saskatchewan say that racism doesn't exist in our province. So that's incredibly problematic. And I think that deters having inclusion of Indigenous peoples being engaged with the election. But what would work best to engage Indigenous communities would be witnessable action. It's really difficult to take the words of parties as truth when many of our communities still don't have safe drinking water in the year 2020. And when we've been secluded because of a canceled provincial bus system, for example, it's really difficult to engage with the election too when our people, Indigenous peoples, comprise up to 90% of children in the child welfare system in this province too. It's also difficult to have faith in parties that only include Indigenous issues as its own separate issue versus integrated throughout their platforms and throughout their plans if they do form government. I think shared decision making needs to be a promise, not just consultation. That might encourage more Indigenous folks to participate. And even something as small as, although also as large as, changing the names of streets and places that are named after racist people. For example, Dewdney Avenue in Regina and John A. Macdonald Road in Saskatoon. I think that folks would be more likely to engage in this election and all future elections if lots of these actionable items have been witnessed.
Adrian, we know the Sask Party has a stronghold in many rural areas of the province. What would you like to see from other parties to maybe make it more competitive?
I think that that's a bit of a double-edged sword. I think that we all know that most rural ridings in Saskatchewan are held by the Sask Party, but it also can become very easy then to be complacent and to take those votes for granted. So I'm definitely looking at them and holding them accountable in order to really create some change, seeing the issues and wanting to do something about it and create policies around that. From some of the other parties that aren't holding a lot of rural seats right now, I think my greatest ask would be for them to really attempt to understand what rural and agricultural issues are. I think that traditionally, for example, our official opposition has not been seen as being very interested in agricultural issues for that reason, because they don't have people in those ridings that are seeing it every day. So it's that much more important that they are connecting, learning, and really seeking out advice on not only what the issues are, but what the solutions are to them.
Last question goes to Juliet. I wonder how you would rate the parties on how they've been doing so far when it comes to addressing issues faced by the BIPOC community in Saskatchewan.
Well, I would definitely give them a failure, an F, as an educator. They're going to be really bad students. I think that, again, part of our problem is that disconnection really with all the parties is that a lot of the platforms are so generic and repetitive, right? Recently, right, we saw the debate about past issues and past histories of car accidents and all that, and there's just and this is again every 4 years. All of the mandates and interests and priorities are not what's we're not interested in those things. They're not going to benefit us. They're not going to benefit people in BIPOC communities, and that's just a shame. I think that there is a lot of change right now in the atmosphere in the United States, all over the world. There's a lot of protests going on, social movement, social justice. People are tired of racism. People are tired of experiencing racism and discrimination. It is killing us here in Saskatchewan. And I think it's time for us to talk, but it's also time for us to take action. And it's time for our elected officials, again, to use their platform and actually be accountable. We are fine with these gestures and the smiles in Saskatchewan, but we need to do better. We have issues with childcare. Taxes are going up. Again, like I said, there's racism and discrimination in schools, in education system. Our students are being pushed out of school, even though they have many years of of experience, or even degrees actually, before they come into Canada. They have to start all over again. That is a lot of stress for a lot of parents, again, who have their children that they have to take care of, and also having to go to work again and making minimal earnings. And so these are all a lot of mental health issues. I mean, racism, discrimination, mental health issues. These are all things that will really get our attention, and I don't see any politician doing that or addressing that in their platform at all.
Juliette Bouchy, Jairus Woodrovich, and Adrian Ivey, thank you so much for your time. These three make up CBC Saskatchewan's contributors panel, and we'll be hearing from them through the rest of the election.